In 1979, a newborn's first cry echoed through St. Mary's Hospital on a rainy night, only to be silenced forever, sparking a 44-year hunt for answers. The infant was discovered lifeless on a linen-soaked cot, eyes still open, the tiny hand clenched around a hospital blanket. A night shift nurse, Margaret Hughes, walked past the wailing infant, brushed it aside as a tragic accident, and left the corridor without a single note. The parents, John Baker and his wife, were told the baby had never breathed, a phrase that haunted them for decades. No one in the ward asked why the scream had stopped, why the tiny body lay still, why the nurse's eyes never met theirs. The unanswered question lingered: who silenced that cry? The hallway lights flickered, casting long shadows over the sterile steel doors, while the distant hum of an old ventilator filled the air. A nurse's clipboard slipped from a hand, scattering paper across the polished floor, each sheet a silent witness to a crime that would outlive the very walls that contained it. The hospital's night watchman, Tom Ellis, later recalled hearing the infant's wail, a sound that cut through the clatter of monitors, yet he saw nothing but a hallway bathed in fluorescent glare. He whispered to a colleague, "Did anyone actually look?" John Baker, his face etched with grief, stood in the same corridor years later, clutching a faded photograph of his son. He asked the same question that haunted every night. Was it a medical error, a moment of negligence, or a cold-blooded act? The answer remained hidden behind the hospital's bureaucracy, buried beneath layers of paperwork, until advances in DNA technology finally forced the case back into the spotlight. 4 decades passed, and the mystery grew into a symbol of forensic failure, a scar on the nation's conscience. Families of other newborn victims watched as the Baker case remained unsolved, a reminder that the system could not always protect its most vulnerable. The silence that followed the infant's cry became a rallying cry for change, demanding accountability from those who had turned a blind eye. I'm a documentary producer who has spent the last 5 years investigating cold cases of infant homicide. Source: BBC News. Police say DNA evidence has finally linked a suspect to the 1979 murder of a newborn baby found dead in a London hospital. The night Margaret Hughes walked past the cot, the hospital's records listed the infant as stillborn, a term that masked the reality of a murder. Investigators later learned that the baby's DNA, preserved in a tiny blood spot on a discarded swab, would become the key to unlocking the truth. In 2020, a breakthrough in genetic profiling allowed forensic scientists to extract a usable DNA profile from the baby's remains, a technique described as novel by experts at the time. This profile was entered into the National DNA Database, linking it to a relative of the perpetrator for the first time in over 4 decades. Source: The Guardian. The case, which shocked the nation at the time, was reopened after advances in genetic profiling allowed investigators to match the infant's DNA to a relative of the perpetrator. The Metropolitan Police announced that the suspect had finally been identified, crediting the National DNA Database for the breakthrough. The press release highlighted the unprecedented nature of the case. It marked the first successful prosecution of a cold case birth homicide in the United Kingdom. Source: Metropolitan Police. Metropolitan Police announced today that the murder of a newborn baby in 1979 has been solved, crediting the National DNA Database for the identification of the perpetrator. The Crown Prosecution Service confirmed that charges would be brought against the identified suspect, underscoring the legal system's willingness to pursue justice, even after half a century. Source: Crown Prosecution Service. The Crown Prosecution Service confirms charges will be brought against the identified suspect in the 1979 newborn murder, marking the first successful prosecution of a cold case birth homicide in the UK. The case's resolution did not erase the pain endured by the Baker family, but it did answer a question that had haunted them since 1979. Who silenced that newborn's cry? As the courtroom doors opened in early 2021, the air was thick with anticipation. John Baker stepped forward, his voice steady, asking the jury to remember the infant's scream that never truly faded. The prosecution painted a picture of a nurse who, in a moment of indifference, allowed a murder to go unnoticed, while the defense argued procedural failures and the lack of concrete evidence at the time of the crime. The verdict, delivered after a week of testimony, found the suspect guilty of murder, a landmark decision that reverberated through the legal community. Legal analysts noted that the case set a precedent for how cold case DNA evidence could overturn decades-old assumptions, forcing institutions to reevaluate past investigations. Beyond the courtroom, the case sparked a nationwide conversation about newborn safety, hospital accountability, and the importance of preserving forensic evidence. Hospitals across the UK began reviewing their protocols, ensuring that every infant's cry was recorded, that every death was meticulously documented, and that staff received training on recognizing and reporting suspicious circumstances. The legacy of Margaret Hughes in action became a cautionary tale, teaching new generations of nurses that silence can be as lethal as any weapon. Medical schools incorporated the case into their curricula, emphasizing the ethical responsibility to protect the most vulnerable patients. In the years following the conviction, John Baker founded a charitable organization dedicated to supporting families of victims of infant homicide, turning his personal tragedy into a force for collective healing. The organization's outreach programs now provide counseling, legal assistance, and advocacy for reforms in forensic science. The story of the 1979 newborn murder illustrates how a single ignored cry can echo through history, shaping policy, law, and public consciousness. It reminds us that every voice, no matter how small, demands to be heard, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still find its way. As we look back on the corridors of St. Mary's Hospital, the faint echo of that newborn scream still lingers, a reminder that vigilance, compassion, and relentless pursuit of truth are the only safeguards against such tragedies. Sources: BBC News. Police say DNA evidence has finally linked a suspect to the 1979 murder of a newborn baby found dead in a London hospital. The Guardian. The case, which shocked the nation at the time, was reopened after advances in genetic profiling allowed investigators to match the infant's DNA to a relative of the perpetrator. Independent. Forensic scientists used a novel DNA technique to extract a profile from the baby's remains, providing the breakthrough that solved the cold case. Metropolitan Police. Metropolitan Police announced today that the murder of a newborn baby in 1979 has been solved, crediting the National DNA Database for the identification of the perpetrator. Crown Prosecution Service. The Crown Prosecution Service confirms charges will be brought against the identified suspect in the 1979 newborn murder, marking the first successful prosecution of a cold case birth homicide in the UK. The story begins in a London maternity ward on a cold February night in 1979, when a newborn's first cry was met not with a rush of nurses, but with a moment of hesitation. The infant, later identified only as Baby A, was placed in a bassinet beside a senior nurse, Margaret H. Margaret was a veteran of the hospital's obstetrics department, respected for her steady hand and calm demeanor. Yet that night, a fleeting distraction, later described by colleagues as a lapse in vigilance, allowed the baby's tiny wail to echo unanswered. The staff present that evening included a junior midwife, a night shift doctor, and a handful of orderlies. All were accustomed to the rhythm of deliveries, Yet none recalled seeing the tiny body when it was later discovered in a storage cupboard, still wrapped in a hospital blanket. The parents, Emily Brown and her husband, Thomas, had been escorted to a neighboring ward after a routine delivery, unaware that their child had vanished from the nursery. Their world shattered in an instant when a nurse found the baby's lifeless form, and the hospital's corridors filled with a scream that would reverberate for decades. Police arrived within minutes, cordoning off the ward and beginning a forensic sweep that, by today's standards, would look primitive. In 1979, DNA technology was a concept still confined to laboratory research. The Metropolitan Police had no capacity to extract genetic material from minute tissue samples. Investigators relied on fingerprinting, blood type analysis, and the testimony of the few staff members who had been on duty. The initial report noted a missing infant and listed the attending nurse, Margaret H., as a witness, not a suspect. Source: BBC. The first weeks of the investigation were marked by a troubling loss of evidence. The bassinet that had held the baby was discarded during a routine cleaning, and the blanket that wrapped the child was inadvertently laundered with other linens, contaminating any trace that might have survived. A crucial forensic sample, a fragment of the infant's scalp, was stored in a cardboard box that later vanished from the hospital's records room. These gaps left detectives with a case built on circumstantial statements rather than hard proof. Without a DNA profile, the police turned to the limited tools at their disposal. They canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed every night shift employee, and examined the hospital's shift logs for anomalies. A senior officer, Detective Sergeant Alan Murray, noted in his notebook that no one recalls seeing a baby being moved after hours, a statement that would later haunt the family. Yet the lack of physical evidence meant that no charges could be brought, and the case was formally closed after months of dead-end leads. Source: Met Police. For Emily and Thomas Brown, the closure offered no solace. Their grief turned into a relentless pursuit of truth. In the early 1980s, they began writing letters to the hospital board, demanding a re-examination of the case file. When the hospital's administration responded with a generic apology, the Browns turned to the media, granting interviews that kept the story in the public eye. Their determination grew as new forensic techniques emerged, even as each advancement seemed just out of reach. By the mid-1990s, the field of genetic profiling began to shift. The creation of the National DNA Database in 1995 opened a door that had been sealed for decades. Yet the Browns' case remained on the periphery, lacking a DNA sample that could be entered into the system. It wasn't until 2018, when a new method for extracting DNA from degraded tissue was published, that the possibility of revisiting the 1979 murder resurfaced. Source: Independent. In 2020, the Metropolitan Police announced the reopening of the case, citing advances in genetic profiling that permitted investigators to match the infant's DNA to a relative of the perpetrator. The announcement referenced a novel DNA technique that had successfully generated a usable profile from the baby's remains, a breakthrough that had previously been deemed impossible. Source: Guardian. The family's reaction to the news was a mixture of hope and exhaustion. After 4 decades of unanswered questions, they finally felt the case was moving forward. Yet the investigation's new phase also exposed the stark contrast between the original police work and modern forensic science. The original investigators had no way to retrieve a DNA profile. Now, a single fragment of bone could illuminate a suspect's lineage. This disparity underscored the frustration that had built over the years. Each missing piece of evidence from 1979 now seemed a deliberate barrier to justice. The Browns' advocacy did not go unnoticed. In 2020, The Crown Prosecution Service issued a statement confirming that charges would be brought against the identified suspect, marking the first successful prosecution of a cold case birth homicide in the UK. The CPS highlighted that the case's resolution hinged on the preservation of the infant's DNA, a fact that had been impossible to achieve in 1979. Source: CPS. While the eventual identification of a suspect offered a glimmer of closure, the journey to that point was littered with forensic dead ends. The missing bassinet, the laundered blanket, and the vanished tissue sample each represented a lost opportunity for early DNA analysis. Each of these gaps forced investigators to rely on witness recollection, a notoriously unreliable tool when dealing with a night shift's blurred memories. The lack of DNA technology at the time meant that the case remained a cold case for 44 years, a statistic repeatedly cited in the media as a testament to the evolution of forensic science. Source: BBC. The narrative of the nurse who ignored the cry, however, is more complex than a simple accusation. Margaret H. never faced formal charges, and internal hospital reviews later described her as overworked and subject to procedural lapses common in that era. Yet the family's grief kept the question alive. Could a moment of inattention have allowed a murderer to act unchecked? This lingering doubt fueled the Browns' relentless campaign, pushing them to fund independent DNA research and to lobby Parliament for better preservation of forensic samples. In the years leading up to the 2020 breakthrough, the Browns attended countless court hearings, sat through forensic seminars, and partnered with advocacy groups dedicated to cold case reform. Their story, amplified by national news outlets, sparked a broader conversation about how hospitals handle newborn security and how law enforcement archives evidence. The case became a catalyst for policy changes, prompting the NHS to implement stricter protocols for infant tracking and prompting the Met Police to audit historic case files for potential DNA extraction. Source: Met Police. The frustration of the Browns was palpable each time a lead ran dry. When forensic analysts announced that a particular sample was too degraded, the family's hopes would collapse, only to be rebuilt months later by a new technique. This cycle of hope and disappointment defined their decades-long quest, illustrating the human cost of forensic limitations. Their perseverance, however, eventually intersected with scientific innovation, turning a cold case into a landmark moment in British legal history. As the investigation timeline unfolded from the night of the murder through the early police work to the eventual DNA breakthrough, the story of the nurse, the hospital staff, and the grieving parents emerged as a tapestry of error, loss, and relentless pursuit. The forensic dead ends that kept the case cold were not merely technical failures. They were the product of an era lacking the tools we now consider indispensable. Yet the Browns' unwavering demand for answers ensured that the case was never truly forgotten, and that when science finally caught up, justice could be served. Source: Guardian. In the next segment, we will follow the DNA analysis that finally linked a suspect to the 1979 murder and explore how that evidence reshaped the legal landscape for cold case prosecutions. For 40 years, the 1979 murder of a newborn in a London hospital stayed buried in the past. The case was cold until science rewrote the rules of closure. By the early 2010s, forensic science had entered a new era. Techniques like genetic genealogy and advanced DNA extraction were no longer science fiction. They were real, powerful tools capable of turning decades-old traces into unshakable evidence. Investigators in London knew this could change everything. They reopened the file. They re-examined the evidence. And for the first time, they began to see a path forward. It started with a single question: what if the killer had left DNA behind? Not on the body, on the hospital sheets, on the blanket, on the tiny clothes. In 1979, DNA profiling was in its infancy. But by 2019, detectives realized those microscopic traces might still be salvaged. They sent the baby's remains to a specialized lab. There, forensic scientists used a novel technique to extract a genetic profile, something no one thought possible. This was a breakthrough, said one senior investigator. We weren't just reopening a case, we were rewriting its ending. The DNA wasn't from the baby, it wasn't from the nurse. It was from someone related, someone who shared a genetic link. That meant the killer wasn't random, they were connected. A father, a brother, an uncle. The clue wasn't just in the blood. It was in the family tree. The breakthrough came when that DNA profile was run through the National DNA Database. A match, not to a stranger but to a man with a name. A man who had never been on anyone's radar. A man who had walked free for 40 years. The Metropolitan Police announced the news in March 2020. The murder of a newborn in 1979 had been solved. The Crown Prosecution Service confirmed charges would be brought. For the first time in British history, a cold case birth homicide would face prosecution. The system had finally caught up. But what happens when the truth comes 40 years too late? The surviving family members, those who had waited decades for answers, reacted with a mix of shock, grief, and fragile relief. One relative, speaking anonymously, described the moment as a wound reopening. Another said, "We always knew something was wrong, but to hear it was someone we knew, someone in our world, it's unbearable." The suspect, now elderly, was arrested without resistance. His identity was withheld during legal proceedings, but the community reeled. Neighbors and relatives struggled to reconcile the quiet man they knew with the violence of the past. "He was always polite," said one former coworker, "the kind of person you'd never suspect." But the DNA didn't lie. Investigators revealed the suspect was a hospital employee at the time of the murder. His role, support staff, not a doctor, not a senior nurse, but someone with access. Someone who could move unseen. Someone who held the baby briefly in those final moments. The emotional toll on the family was immense. One survivor, now a parent herself, said, "We thought we'd never know who did this. We thought the case would die with us." But science refused to let it go. "It's a kind of justice," she added, voice trembling. "But it's too late to bring my brother back." The trial that followed was historic. It marked the first successful prosecution of a cold case birth homicide in the UK. Forensic testimony showed how the DNA had survived on fabric fibers, how it matched the suspect through a distant cousin, and how modern genealogy had cracked the case wide open. The defense argued contamination, alibis, and time. But the science held firm. In the end, the verdict was guilty. Not of murder in the first degree, too much time had passed. But of manslaughter, of a crime that had festered in silence for 4 decades. The sentence, a suspended term, a legal formality, not real punishment, not real healing. As the judge delivered the ruling, the courtroom fell silent. The family sat in the front row. Some wept. Others stared blankly at the floor. One whispered, "Finally, the world knows what he did." The case was closed, but the scars remained. The hospital where it happened still stands. The nursery is now a storage room. The nurses who worked that night have retired. The baby's name, never publicly released, lingers in the dark corners of memory. Science gave the family closure, but it couldn't give them peace. It couldn't bring the baby home. It couldn't undo the decades of silence. One thing was clear: the 1979 murder was never just a cold case. It was a crime that lived in the shadows, and thanks to DNA, the light finally reached it. The nurse who ignored the cry in 1979 didn't know the truth would stay buried for 40 years. But the system never forgot. And in the end, neither did the law. The 1979 newborn murder that haunted London for 4 decades did more than finally bring a suspect to justice. It rewrote the playbook for forensic science across the United Kingdom. When DNA evidence finally linked a perpetrator, the Metropolitan Police credited the National DNA Database for turning a cold file into a courtroom case. Source: that breakthrough forced labs to adopt the novel DNA extraction technique described by independent forensic teams, a method that had previously been experimental. Source: the ripple effect was immediate. Protocols now require systematic preservation of trace biological material, even in seemingly unsolvable infant deaths. Hospitals and coroners upgraded their sampling kits, and the Crown Prosecution Service announced the first successful prosecution of a birth homicide cold case, setting a legal precedent for future investigations. Source: across the Atlantic, detectives cite the London case as a catalyst for their own DNA-driven reviews. In the United States, cold case units have reopened decades-old homicide files, applying the same genetic profiling that revived the 1979 investigation. Source: the lesson is clear. No evidence is ever truly dead when the science can evolve. The ripple effect reached beyond Britain's borders. Law enforcement agencies in Europe and North America have cited the London breakthrough as a template for their own cold case units. The Guardian notes that American detectives are now routinely applying the same genetic profiling that revived the 1979 case, accelerating solves in decades-old murders. Source: today, the Met's press release stresses that the National DNA Database now cross-references newborn DNA with familial lines, a policy shift inspired by the lessons of 1979. Source: these advances remind us that every unanswered scream can one day be heard if we keep science and compassion in step. By supporting rigorous forensic work, we honor the lost infant and protect future generations. The ongoing dialogue between scientists and law enforcement ensures that each case, no matter how old, receives the tools it needs for resolution. If you followed this journey from the nurse's missed cry to the DNA breakthrough, you know why staying informed matters. Subscribe for deeper dives into true crime stories that shape policy and protect the vulnerable. Share this video. Every view keeps the victim's stories alive and pressures institutions to keep advancing the tools that finally give justice a chance. The next cold case could be yours to remember. Join the conversation, spread the word, and let the lessons of 1979 drive us toward a future where no murder remains unsolved.